Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. Just so senators have an idea of the evening, we expect to go about 2 to 2.5 hours. I'll make a presentation. Representative Lofgren from California will make a presentation. I'll make a final presentation, and then we will be done for the evening. As an encouraging voice told me, keep it up, but don't keep it up too long. So we will do our best not to keep it up too long. I'm going to turn now to the part of the chronology that picks up right after that July 25th call and walk through the increasingly explicit pressure campaign waged on Ukraine in order to get President Trump's deliverable, the investigations meant to tarnish his opponent and help his reelection. Now remember, by the end of July, Ukraine was aware of President Trump's requests for investigation to help his political efforts and had come to know that President Trump put a freeze on security assistance. So this is by the end of July. They also clearly understood that President Trump was withholding an Oval Office meeting until those investigations were announced. Both were very critical to Ukraine as a sign of U.S. support and as a matter of their national security. And their national security, of course, implicates our national security. In the weeks after the July 25th call, President Trump's hand-picked representatives escalated their efforts to get the public announcement of the investigations from Ukraine. So let's go through this step by step, because the 3 weeks following the July 25th call tell so much about this pressure scheme. Let's start with July 26. On July 26, so this is the day after the call, Ambassador Volker sends a text message to Giuliani. And that text message says, "Hi, Mr. Mayor. You may have heard the President had a great call with Ukrainian President yesterday. Exactly the right messages as we discussed. Please send dates when you will be in Madrid. I am seeing YERMAK tomorrow morning. He will come to you in Madrid. Thanks for your help, Kurt." So here we are the day after that call. As my colleague demonstrates, this same day, so July 26th, the date of that second infamous call between President Trump this time and Gordon Sondland that you heard the diplomat David Holmes describe. So that's same day, July 26th, that we're talking about right now, where there's this text message. Now, of course, in that July 25th call, the President wants to connect Rudy Giuliani with the President of Ukraine and his people. And so this is a follow-up where Ambassador Volker is saying to Giuliani, it was a great call with Ukraine President, exactly the right messages as we discussed. And we know, of course, those messages were the need to do this political investigation. Please send dates when you'll be in Madrid. I'm seeing YERMAK tomorrow morning. He will come to you in Madrid. So here is Ambassador Volker, one of the three amigos, following up, arranging this meeting between Giuliani and the Ukrainians. Giuliani replied, setting a meeting in Europe with President Zelensky's top aide for the very next week. Quote, "I will arrive on August 1 and until 5, he wrote. Now remember, on July 22nd, so a few days before this and before the call, Ambassador Volker had connected Giuliani originally with YERMAK, and they agreed to meet. So this is a follow-up. You have that arrangement being made by Volker and Giuliani before the call, then you have the call, and now you have the follow-up to arrange the meeting in Madrid. And so they do meet in Madrid. This is August 2nd. Andrei Yermak, Zelensky's top aide, flew to Madrid, meets with Rudy Giuliani, who they know represented the President's interests. Both Giuliani and Yermak walk away from this meeting in Madrid, clearly understanding that a White House meeting is linked to Zelensky's announcement of the investigations. In separate conversations with Giuliani and Yermak after this Madrid meeting, Volker said he learned that Giuliani wanted the Ukrainians to issue a statement, including specific mentions of the two investigations that the President wanted. According to Ambassador Volker's testimony, Yermak told him that his meeting with Giuliani was very good, and immediately added that the Ukrainians asked for a White House meeting during the week of September 16th. Yermak presses Volker on the White House meeting date, saying that he was waiting for confirmation. Maybe you know the date. And this is a recurrent theme that we've seen through the text messages and other documents, and that is the recurrent request for this meeting, the pressing for this meeting by the Ukrainians because it was so important to them. Giuliani's objective was clear to Ambassadors Volker and Sondland, who took over communications with Yermak. Here's Ambassador Sondland.
I first communicated with Mr. Giuliani in early August, several months later. Mr. Giuliani emphasized that the President wanted a public statement from President Zelensky committing Ukraine to look into the corruption issues. Mr. Giuliani specifically mentioned the 2016 election, including the DNC server, and BURISMA as two topics of importance to the President.
Giuliani exerted significant influence in this process. In fact, when on August 4th, Yermak inquired again about the presidential meeting, Ambassador Volker turned not to the National Security Council staff or to the State Department to arrange it and follow up. He turns to Giuliani again. Volker told Yermak that he would speak with Giuliani later that day and would call the Ukrainian president's aide afterward. Volker then texts Giuliani to ask about the Madrid meeting and to set up the call that he had mentioned to Yermak. Giuliani replies that the meeting with Yermak was excellent and that he would call later. Phone records obtained by the committees show a 16-minute call on August 5th between Ambassador Volker and Giuliani. Ambassador Volker then texts Yermak, "Hi, Andre. Had a good long talk with Rudy. Call anytime. Kurt." Separately, Volker told Ambassador Sondland, Giuliani was happy with that meeting and it looks like things are turning around. A reference to Volker's hope that satisfying Giuliani would break down President Trump's reservations concerning Ukraine. But things had not turned around by the end of that first week of August, by August 7th. The aid was still on hold, and there had been no movement on setting a date for the White House meeting. Ambassador Volker then reaches out to Giuliani to try to get things moving. Ambassador Volker texts Giuliani to recommend that he report to the boss, meaning President Trump, about his meeting with Yermak in Madrid. Specifically, he wrote, this is Volker writing to Giuliani, "Hi, Rudy. Hope you made it back safely. Let's meet if you're coming to D.C., and would be good if you could convey results of your meeting in Madrid to the boss so we can get a firm date for the visit." So this is Ambassador Volker following up Giuliani. Giuliani's met with the top aide to the President of Ukraine in Madrid, and he wants Giuliani to convey to the boss, to Trump, how good that meeting in Madrid was about the investigations so they can get the President of Ukraine in the door at the White House. Now, think about how unusual this is. This is the President's personal lawyer who's on this personal mission on behalf of his client to get these investigations in Ukraine. The President of Ukraine can't get in the door of the Oval Office. And who are they going to? Are they going to the Security Council? No. Are they going to the State Department? No. They tried all that. They're going to the President's personal lawyer. Does that sound like an official policy to try to fight corruption? Why would you go outside of the normal channel to do that? You wouldn't. No, you go to your personal attorney who's on a personal mission that he admits is not foreign policy when your objective has nothing to do with policy. When your objective is a corrupt one. Now, what does that mean, to have a corrupt objective? Well, it means an illicit one. It means an impermissible one. It means one that furthers your own interest at the cost of the national interest. The willingness to break the law, like the Impoundment Control Act, by withholding aid, is indicative of that corrupt purpose, the lengths the President would go, not in furtherance of U.S. policy, but against U.S. policy. Not even a difference on policy at all. The mere pursuit of personal interest, the pursuit of an illegal effort to get foreign interference, is the very embodiment of a corrupt intent. So here we are, August 7th. And Volker is saying, Rudy, if you're coming to D.C., let's get together. It'd be good if you can talk to the boss, because we can't get a meeting other way. Around that time, Ambassador Volker received a text message from YERMAK, who asked him, and this is YERMAK, asking Volker, "Hi, Kurt, how are you? Do you have some news about the White House meeting date?" And Volker responds, "Not yet. I texted Rudy earlier to make sure he weighs in following your meeting. Gordon," meaning Sondland, "should be speaking with the President on Friday. We are pressing this." So there is, Gordon Sondland is pressing this. This is the man you've heard from already, Gordon Sondland, the man who says there was absolutely a quid pro quo. You've asked about a quid pro quo. There was a quid pro quo about this White House meeting. This is what they're talking about right here. Gordon will be speaking with the President on Friday. We are pressing this. Ambassador Volker's contact with Giuliani spurred a flurry of communications. The patterns of calls from August 8th strongly suggest Giuliani is attempting to call the White House to speak to a senior White House official, left a message, then had a 4-minute call with that official later that night. We don't know from the call records who that White House official was, but recall that Giuliani has publicly stated that when he spoke to the White House, he usually spoke to President Trump, his client. Also on August 8th, YERMAK texts Volker that he had some news. Ambassador Volker replies that he can talk then, and Ambassador Volker updates Giuliani in a text the next day. Volker says to Giuliani in the text, "Hi, Mr. Mayor, I had a good chat with YERMAK last night. He was pleased with your phone call. Mentioned," he's referring to President Zelensky here, "making a statement. Can we all get on the phone to make sure I advise," and here he's referring to President Zelensky, "correctly as to what he should be saying. Want to make sure we get this done right." So here, August 9th, there's an effort by Volker to make sure that they get the statement right about the investigations. Because if they can't get the statement right, he ain't going to get in the door of the Oval Office. It also makes clear who is exactly in charge of this, and that's Rudy Giuliani. Ambassador Volker is checking with Rudy Giuliani about what he should advise President Zelensky. And we know that Giuliani is taking his orders from President Trump. Text messages and call records obtained by the committees show that Ambassador Volker and Giuliani connected by phone twice around noon on August 9th for several minutes each. Following the calls with Giuliani, Ambassador Volker created a 3-way group chat using WhatsApp that included himself, Ambassador Sondland, and YERMAK. Ambassador Volker initiated the chat around 2:20 that day. And this is Volker chatting with Sondland and YERMAK. It's a 3-way chat. And Volker says, "Hi, Andre," meaning YERMAK. "We have all consulted here, including with Rudy. Could you do a call later today or tomorrow, your afternoon time?" And Sondland says, "I have a call scheduled at 3 p.m. Eastern for the 3 of us. Ops will call." Call records obtained by the committee show that on August 9th, Ambassador Sondland twice connected with phone lines associated with the White House. Once in the early afternoon for about 18 minutes and once in the late afternoon for about 2 minutes. We know that Ambassador Sondland had direct access to President Trump. After all this activity, Ambassador Sondland and Volker thought they had a breakthrough. Finally, a breakthrough. Minutes after this call, which was likely with Tim Morrison about a possible date for the White House meeting, Ambassador Volker and Sondland discussed the agreement they believed they had reached. And starts with Sondland in this text message. "Morrison ready to get dates as soon as YERMAK confirms." Volker says, "Excellent. How did you sway him?" "Not sure I did," says Sondland. "I think POTUS really wants the deliverable." Well, we know what that deliverable is. It's the political investigations. Volker says, "But did you know that?" And Sondland says, "Yep. Clearly lots of convos, meaning conversations, going on." And Volker says, "Okay, then that's good. It's coming from 2 separate sources." Ambassador Sondland told the committees that the deliverable required by President Trump was a press statement from President Zelensky committing to do the investigations into the Bidens and the allegation of Ukraine election interference that President Trump mentioned on July 25th. But Tim Morrison testified that he didn't know anything about the deliverable. He was just involved in trying to schedule the White House meeting, which everyone wanted to schedule as a sign of support for President Zelensky and our ally Ukraine. But Trump's agents wouldn't just accept Ukraine's word for it. Ambassador Sondland then recommended to Ambassador Volker that YERMAK share a draft of the press statement to ensure that the statement would comport with the President's expectations. So here on August 9th, so we're still less than 2 weeks after the July 25th call, or we're about 2 weeks. Sondland says in this message, to avoid misunderstandings, might be helpful to ask Andre for a draft statement, parentheses embargoed, so that we can see exactly what they propose to cover. Even though Z, referring to Zelensky, does a live presser, they can still summarize in a brief statement. Thoughts? And Volker says, agree. At his deposition, Ambassador Sondland said that he suggested reviewing a written summary of the statement because he was concerned that President Zelensky would say whatever he would say on live television and it still wouldn't be good enough for Rudy / the President, unquote. YERMAK, in turn, was concerned that the announcement would still not result in the coveted White House meeting. On August 10th, YERMAK texted Volker attempting to schedule a White House meeting before the Ukrainian president made a public statement in support of the investigations into BURISMA and the 2016 election. So you can see what's going on here. The president and his agent, Giuliani, they want this public statement of the investigations before they'll give a date. And the Ukrainians want a date before they have to commit to making public they're going to do the investigations. And so you've had this standoff where each is trying to get the deliverable first. But there's no debate about what the deliverable is on either side. There's no debate about the quid pro quo here. You give me this, I'll give you that. You give me the White House meeting, I'll give you the public announcement of the investigation into your political rival. No, no, no. You give me the announcement of the investigation into my rival, and then I'll give you the meeting. The only debate here is about which comes first. So August 10th, YERMAK texts Volker, I think it's possible to make this declaration and mention all these things which we discussed yesterday, but it will be logic to do after we receive a confirmation of date. We inform about date of visit, about our expectations and our guarantees for future visit. Let's discuss it. Ambassador Volker responded that he agreed, but that first they would have to iron out a statement and use that to get a date, after which President Zelensky would give the statement. The two decided to have a call the next day and to include Ambassador Sondland. YERMAK texts Ambassador Volker, excellent. Once we have a date, we will call for a press briefing announcing upcoming visit and outlining vision for the reboot of U.S.-Ukraine relationship, including, among other things, BURISMA and election meddling in the investigations. YERMAK was also in direct contact with Ambassador Sondland regarding this revised approach. In fact, he sent Ambassador Sondland the same text message. Ambassador Sondland kept the leadership of the State Department in the loop. On August 10th, he told Ambassador Volker that he had reported to T. Ulrich Breckbull, counselor of the Department of State, who Sondland testified frequently consulted with Secretary Pompeo. Sondland wrote to Volker, I briefed Ulrich, all good. So Ulrich is in the loop. Sondland and Volker continued to pursue the statement from Zelensky on the investigations. The next day, Ambassador Sondland emails Breckbull and Lisa Kenna, the State Department's executive secretary, about efforts to secure a public statement and a big presser from President Zelensky. Sondland hoped it might, quote, make the boss happy enough to authorize an invitation. After first being evasive on the topic, Secretary Pompeo has subsequently acknowledged that he listened in on the July 25th call. Now, since he was on the call, Pompeo must have understood what would make the boss that is, the President, happy enough to schedule a White House meeting. Again, everyone was in the loop. On August 11th, Ambassador Volker sent Giuliani a text message. This is Volker to Giuliani. Hi, Rudy. We have heard back from Andre again. They are writing the statement now and will send it to us. Can you talk for 5 minutes before noon today? And Giuliani says, yes, just call. That's August 11th. On the next day, August 12th, YERMAK sent Ambassador Volker an initial version of the draft statement by text. Notably, as we saw earlier, this statement from the Ukrainians doesn't explicitly mention Burisma, Biden, or 2016. Election investigations that the President has been seeking. So you can see what's going on here now. There was this game of chicken. You go first. No, we'll go first. You give us the date, we'll give you the statement. No, you give us the statement, we'll give you the date. And now, realizing, okay, they've got to give the statement first, Ukraine tries to give them a generic statement that doesn't really go into specifics about these investigations. And why? You can imagine why. Ukrainians don't want to have to go out in public and say they're going to do these investigations. Because they're not stupid. Because they understood this would pull them right into U.S. presidential politics. Because it was intended to. Which isn't in Ukraine's interest, it's not in our interest either. And Ukraine understood that. And so they resisted. First they resisted having to do the public statement, and then they wanted to make sure they'd get the deliverable, and then when they had to make the statement, they didn't want to be specific for one thing, for another thing. This was what Zelensky campaigned on. He was going to fight corruption. He was going to end political investigations. So he didn't want to be specific. So he sends the statement that doesn't have the specific references. And Ambassador Volker explained during his testimony that was not what Giuliani was requesting, and it would not satisfy Giuliani or Donald Trump. Now, presumably, if the President was interested in corruption, that statement would have been enough. But all he was interested in was an investigation or an announcement of an investigation into his rival and this debunked theory about 2016. Now, the conversation that Volker referred to in his earlier testimony took place on the morning of August 13th, when Giuliani made clear that the specific investigations related to Burisma, Code for Biden's, and the 2016 election had to be included in order to get the White House meeting. So the Americans sent back to the Ukrainian top aide a revised draft that includes now the two investigations, and you've seen the side-by-side. This was then the essence of the quid pro quo regarding the meeting, and this direction came from President Trump. Here is how Ambassador Sondland put it.
Mr. Giuliani's requests were a quid pro quo for arranging a White House visit for President Zelensky. Mr. Giuliani demanded that Ukraine make a public statement announcing the investigations of the 2016 election, DNC server, and Burisma. Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and we knew these investigations were important to the President.
Now, according to witness testimony, as you might imagine, Ukrainian officials were very uncomfortable with the draft that Giuliani, Volker, and Sondland were negotiated. They understood that the statement was the deliverable that President Trump wanted. But yielding to President Trump's demands would in essence force President Zelensky to break his promise to the Ukrainian people to root out corruption, because politically motivated investigations are a hallmark of the kind of corruption that Ukraine has been plagued with in the past. Mr. YERMAK tried to get some confirmation that the requested investigations were legitimate. In response to the draft statement, YERMAK asks Volker, quote, whether any request had ever been made by the U.S. to investigate election interference in 2016. In other words, whether any request had been made by any official U.S. law enforcement agency through formal channels, as you would expect if it were a legitimate request. Ambassador Volker tried to find a satisfactory answer. On August 15th, Volker's assistant asked Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent whether there was any precedent for such a request for investigations. At his deposition, Kent testified that, if you're asking me, have we ever gone to the Ukrainians and asked them to investigate or prosecute individuals for political reasons? The answer is, I hope we haven't, and we shouldn't, because that goes against everything that we are trying to promote in the post-Soviet states for the last 28 years, which is the promotion of the rule of law. The next day, we're now on August 16th. In a conversation with Ambassador Bill Taylor, the U.S. ambassador in Kyiv, and Ambassador Taylor stepped in when Ambassador Yovanovitch was pushed out, Taylor, quote, amplified the same theme and told Kent that, quote, Yermak was very uncomfortable with the idea of investigations and suggested it should be done officially and put in writing. As a result, it became clear to Kent in mid-August that Ukraine was being pressured to conduct politically motivated investigations. Kent told Ambassador Taylor, that's wrong, and we shouldn't be doing it as a matter of U.S. policy. Ambassador Volker claimed that he stopped pursuing the statement from the Ukrainians around this time because of the concerns raised by Zelensky's aide. At his deposition, and despite all of his efforts to secure a statement announcing these very specific political investigations desired by the President, Ambassador Volker testified that he agreed with Yermak's concerns and advised him that making those specific references was not a good idea because making those statements might look like it would play into our domestic politics. Without specific references to the politically damaging investigations that Trump demanded, the agreement just wouldn't work. Ukraine did not release the statement, and in turn, the White House meeting was not scheduled. As it turns out, Ambassador Sondland and Volker did not achieve the breakthrough after all. Now let's go into what finally breaks the logjam, because that involves the military aid. With efforts to trade a White House meeting for a press statement announcing the investigations temporarily scuttled, Sondland and Volker go back to the drawing board. On August 19th, Ambassador Sondland told Volker that he drove the larger issue home with Yermak, President Zelensky's top aide, particularly that this was now bigger than a White House meeting, bigger than just a White House meeting, and was about the relationship per se. The relationship per se, not just about the meeting anymore. It's about everything. It's about everything. By this time in late August, the hold and security assistance had been in place for more than a month, and there was still no credible explanation offered by the White House, despite some, like Ambassador Sondland, repeatedly asking. There were no interagency meetings since July 31st, and the Defense Department had withdrawn its assurances that it could even comply with the law, which indeed it couldn't. Every agency in the administration opposed the hold. As the Government Accountability Office confirmed, concerned DOD and OMB officials had been right that the President's holding of the aid was an unlawful act, but President Trump was not budging. At the same time, despite the persistent efforts of numerous people, President Trump refused to schedule the coveted White House visit for President Zelensky until the investigations were announced that would benefit his campaign. Here is what Ambassador Sondland said about the hold on funds and its link to the politically motivated investigations in Ukraine.
In the absence of any credible explanation for the suspension of aid, I later came to believe that the resumption of security aid would not occur until there was a public statement from Ukraine committing to the investigations of the 2016 elections and BURISMA, as Mr. Giuliani had demanded.
From the embassy in Kyiv, David Holmes reached the same conclusion, a conclusion as simple as 2 + 2 = 4.
Mr. Holmes, you have testified that by late August you had a clear impression that the security assistance hold was somehow connected to the investigations that President Trump wanted. How did you conclude that? How did you reach that clear conclusion?
Sir, we've been hearing about the investigation since March, months before, and we've been. President Zelensky had received a letter, congratulatory letter from the president, saying he'd be pleased to meet him following his inauguration in May. And we hadn't been able to get that meeting, and then the security hold came up with no explanation. And I'd be surprised if any of the Ukrainians, you said earlier, we discussed earlier, sophisticated people, when they received no explanation for why that hold was in place, they wouldn't have drawn that conclusion.
Because the investigations were still being pursued?
Correct.
And the hold was still remaining without explanation?
Correct.
So this to you was the only logical conclusion that you could reach?
Correct.
Sort of like 2 + 2 = 4?
Exactly.
Sondland explained the predicament he believed he faced with a hold on aid to Ukraine.
As my other State Department colleagues have testified, this security aid was critical to Ukraine's defense and should not have been delayed. I expressed this view to many during this period, but my goal at the time was to do what was necessary to get the aid released, to break the logjam. I believe that the public statement we had been discussing for weeks was essential to advancing that goal. I really regret that the Ukrainians were placed in that predicament, but I do not regret doing what I could to try to break the logjam and to solve the problem.
On August 22nd, Ambassador Sondland tried to break that logjam, as he put it, regarding both the security assistance hold and the White House meeting. Ambassador Sondland described those efforts in his public testimony. Let's listen to him again.
In preparation for the September 1 Warsaw meeting, I asked Secretary Pompeo whether a face-to-face conversation between Trump and Zelensky would help to break the logjam. And this was when President Trump was still intending to travel to Warsaw. Specifically, on August 22nd, I emailed Secretary Pompeo directly, copying Secretary Kenna. I wrote, and this is my email to Secretary Pompeo, should we block time in Warsaw for a short pull-aside for POTUS to meet Zelensky? I would ask Zelensky to look him in the eye and tell him that once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place in mid-September, that Zelensky should be able to move forward publicly and with confidence on those issues of importance to POTUS in the U.S. Hopefully that will help break the logjam. The Secretary replied, yes.
Sondland also explained that both he and Secretary Pompeo understood that issues of importance to the President were the 2 sham investigations the President wanted to help his re-election efforts, and that reference to the logjam meant both the security assistance and the White House meeting. At the end of August, National Security Advisor John Bolton arrived in Ukraine for an official visit. David Holmes took notes in Ambassador Bolton's meetings and testified about Ambassador Bolton's message to the Ukrainians.
Shortly thereafter, on August 27th, Ambassador Bolton visited Ukraine and brought welcome news that President Trump had agreed to meet President Zelensky on September 1st in Warsaw. Ambassador Bolton further indicated that the hold on security assistance would not be lifted prior to the Warsaw meeting, where it would hang on whether President Zelensky was able to, quote, favorably impress President Trump.
Let's think about that for a minute. Unless you have something further to say. Let's think about that for a minute. Bolton further indicated that the hold on security assistance would not be lifted prior to the Warsaw meeting, where it would hang on whether President Zelensky was able to favorably impress President Trump. Well, what do you think would favorably impress President Trump? What were the only two things that President Trump asked of President Zelensky? What were the two things that Rudy Giuliani was asking of President Zelensky and his top aides? What would favorably impress Donald Trump? Would Donald Trump be favorably impressed if President Zelensky were to tell him about this new corruption court or new legislation in the Rada, or how negotiations with the Russians were going, or how they're bringing about defense reform? Had any of those things ever come up in any of these text messages, any of these emails, any of these phone calls, any of these conversations? Of course not. Of course not. There was only one thing that was going to favorably impress President Trump in Warsaw, and that is if Zelensky told him to his face, I'm going to do these political investigations. I don't want to do them. You know I don't want to do them. I've resisted doing them, but I'm at war with Russia, and I can't wait anymore. I can't wait anymore. I'm sure that would have impressed Donald Trump. But the meeting between the two presidents never happened in Warsaw. President Trump canceled the trip at the last moment. Before Bolton left Kyiv, Ambassador Taylor asked for a private meeting. Ambassador Taylor explained that he was extremely concerned about the hold on security assistance. He described the meeting to us during his testimony.
Near the end of Ambassador Bolton's visit, I asked to meet him privately, during which I expressed to him my serious concern about the withholding of military assistance to Ukraine while the Ukrainians were defending their country from Russian aggression. Ambassador Bolton recommended that I send a first-person cable to Secretary Pompeo directly, relaying my concerns.
Now, in the State Department, sending a first-person cable is an extraordinary step. State Department cables are ordinarily written in the third person. As Ambassador Taylor testified at his deposition, sending a first-person cable gets attention because there are not many first-person cables that come in. In fact, in his decades of service in the diplomatic corps, he had never written a single one until now. Taylor sent that cable on August 29th. Would you like me to read that to you right now? I would like to read it to you right now, except I don't have it, because the State Department wouldn't provide it. But if you'd like me to read it to you, we can do something about that. We can insist on getting that from the State Department. If you'd like to know what John Bolton had in mind when he thought that Zelensky could favorably impress the president in Warsaw, we can find that out too, just for the asking, and a document called a subpoena. So Taylor sends that cable August 29th. The State Department did not provide that cable to us in response to the subpoena. But witnesses who reviewed it described it as a powerful message that described the folly of withholding military aid from Ukraine at a time when it was facing incursion from Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. That cable also sought to explain that U.S. assistance to Ukraine was vital to U.S. national security as well. Now, why don't they want us to see that cable? Why don't they want us to see that cable? Maybe they don't want you to see that cable because that cable from a Vietnam veteran describes just how essential that military assistance was, not just to Ukraine. Maybe they don't want you to see that cable because it describes just how important that military assistance is to us. To us. President's Council would love you to believe this is just about Ukraine. You don't need to care about Ukraine. Who cares about Ukraine? How many people could find Ukraine on the map? Why should we care about Ukraine? Well, we should care about Ukraine. They're an ally of ours. If it matters to us, we should care about the fact that in 1994, when we asked them to give up their nuclear weapons that they had inherited from the Soviet Union, and they didn't want to give them up, and we were worried about proliferation, We said, hey, if you give them up, which you don't want to do because you're worried the Russians might invade, if you give them up, we will help assure your territorial integrity. We made that commitment. I hope we care about that. I hope we care about that because they did give them up. And you know what? Just what they feared took place. The Russians moved across their border, and they remain occupying part of Ukraine. That's the word of America we gave. And we're breaking that word. Why? For help with a political campaign? Ambassador Taylor was exactly right. That's crazy. It's worse than crazy. It's repulsive. It's repugnant. It breaks our word. And to do it in the name of these corrupt investigations is also contrary to everything we espouse around the world. I used to be part of a commission in the House on democracy assistance, where we would meet with parliamentarians, and I know my Senate colleagues do much the same thing. And we would urge our colleagues to observe the rule of law, not to engage in political investigations and prosecutions. I don't know how we make that argument now. I don't know how we look our allies or these burgeoning democracies in the face, our fellow parliamentarians, and make that argument now. How do we make that argument now? Now, testimony indicated that Secretary Pompeo eventually carried that cable into the White House. But there's no evidence that those national security concerns that they don't want you to see were able to outweigh the President's personal interest in his getting foreign help in his re-election campaign. There's no evidence at all. Now we get to August 28th. Politico was the first to publicly report that President Trump had implemented a hold on nearly $400 million of U.S. military assistance to Ukraine that had been appropriated by Congress. Now that the worst-kept secret was public, Ukrainian officials immediately expressed their alarm and concern to their American counterparts. As witnesses explained, the Ukrainians had two serious concerns. One, of course, was the aid itself, which was vital to their ability to fight off Russia. But in addition, they were worried about the symbolism of the hold, that it signaled to Russia and Vladimir Putin that the United States was wavering in its support for Ukraine. Witnesses testified that this was a division that Russia could and would exploit to drive further wedge between the United States and Ukraine to its advantage. This second concern was likely why Ukrainian officials had wanted the hold to remain a secret in the first place, because it would add to the negative impact to Ukraine if the hold itself became public. It was bad enough that the President of the United States put a hold on their aid. It was going to be far worse if it became public, as indeed it did. Andrei Yermak, the same Zelensky aide, sent Ambassador Volker a link to the Politico story, and then texted, "Need to talk with you." Other Ukrainian officials also expressed concerns to Ambassador Volker that the Ukrainian government was being singled out and penalized for some reason. Well, what do we think that reason was? Why were they being singled out? Why was that country being singled out? That was the one country that this president could lever for help against an opponent he feared. That's why Ukraine was being singled out. On August 29th, Yermak also contacted Ambassador Taylor. Yermak said the Ukrainians were very concerned about the hold on military assistance. He said that he and other Ukrainian officials would be willing to travel to Washington to explain to U.S. officials the importance of this assistance. Ambassador Taylor, who was on the ground in Ukraine, explained the Ukrainian viewpoint and, frankly, their desperation.
In September, the Minister of Defense, for example, came to me, I would use the word desperate, to figure out why the assistance was being held. He thought that perhaps if he went to Washington to talk to you, to talk to the Secretary of Defense, to talk to the President, he would be able to find out and reassure provide whatever answer was necessary to have that assistance released.
Without any official explanation for the hold, American officials could provide little reassurance to their Ukrainian counterparts. It has been publicly reported that President Trump, Secretary Esper, and Secretary Pompeo met in late August and that they all implored the President to release the aid. But President Trump continued to refuse to release the aid. As of August 30th, the President was clearly directing OMB to continue the hold on security assistance. In documents reviewed by Just Security but withheld from the Congress by OMB on the President's instructions, OMB official Michael Duffy emailed DOD Controller Elaine McCusker that there is, quote, clear direction from POTUS to continue the hold. So here we are, August 30th. A month after that July 25th call, aid still being withheld, Ukrainians still holding on, still not willing to capitulate, not willing to violate Zelensky's whole campaign pledge about not engaging in corrupt investigations. That same day, August 30th, Republican Senator Ron Johnson spoke with Ambassador Sondland to express his concern about President Trump's decision to withhold military assistance to Ukraine. Senator Johnson described that call in an interview with the Wall Street Journal. According to Senator Johnson, Ambassador Sondland told him that if Ukraine would commit to, quote, get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, if President Trump has that confidence, then he'll release the military spending. Senator Johnson added, at that suggestion, I winced. My reaction was, oh God, I don't want to see those two things combined. The next day, August 31st, Senator Johnson spoke by phone with President Trump regarding the decision to withhold aid to Ukraine. According to the Wall Street Journal, President Trump denied the quid pro quo that Senator Johnson had learned of from Ambassador Sondland. At the same time, however, President Trump refused to authorize Senator Johnson to tell Ukrainian officials on his upcoming trip to Kyiv that the aid would be forthcoming. The message that Ambassador Sondland communicated to Senator Johnson mirrored that used by President Trump during the July 25th call with President Zelensky, in which President Trump twice asked the Ukrainian leader to get to the bottom of it, including in connection to an investigation into the debunked conspiracy theory of Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election. It also mirrored the language of the text message that Ambassador Volker sent to President Zelensky's aide just before the July 25th call. Indeed, despite the President's self-serving denials, the message was clear. President Trump wanted the investigations, and he would withhold not one but two acts vested in him by the power of his office in order to get them. Now begins September. September 1st. The President was supposed to go to Warsaw, as we know, but he doesn't go to Warsaw. Mike Pence goes to Warsaw. Jennifer Williams, Special Advisor to the Vice President for Europe and Russia, learned of the change in the President's travel plans on August 29th. The Vice President's National Security Advisor asked, at the request of Vice President Pence, for an update on the status of the security assistance that had just been publicly revealed in Politico and would be a critical issue during the bilateral meeting between the Vice President and President Zelensky in Warsaw. The delegation arrives in Warsaw and gathers in a hotel room to brief Vice President Pence before he met with the Ukrainian President. National Security Advisor Bolton led the meeting. As Williams described it, advisors in the room, quote, agreed on the need to get a final decision on security assistance as soon as possible so that it could be implemented before the end of the year. But Vice President Pence did not have authority from the President to release the aid. Ambassador Sondland also attended that briefing. At the end of it, he expressed concern directly to Vice President Pence about the security assistance being held until the Ukrainians announced the very same politically motivated investigations at the heart of this scheme. Now, you mentioned that you also had a conversation with Vice President Pence before his meeting with President Zelensky in Warsaw, and that you raised the concern you had as well that the security assistance was being withheld because of the President's desire to get a commitment from Zelensky to pursue these political investigations. What did you say to the Vice President?
I was in a briefing with several people, and I just spoke up and I said, it appears that everything is stalled until this statement gets made, words to that effect, and that's what I believe to be the case based on the work that the three of us had been doing, Volker, Perry, and myself. And the Vice President nodded like, he heard what I said, and that was pretty much it, as I recall.
Everyone was in the loop. Ambassador Sondland testified that Vice President Pence was neither surprised nor dismayed by the description of this quid pro quo. At the beginning of the bilateral meeting between President Zelensky and Vice President Pence, as expected, the first question from President Zelensky related to the status of the security assistance. As Vice President Pence's aide, Jennifer Williams, testified, President Zelensky explained that just equally with the financial and physical value of the assistance, that it was the symbolic nature of that assistance that really was the show of U.S. support for Ukraine and for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Later that day, Vice President Pence spoke to the President about his meeting with President Zelensky. But the hold on security assistance remained in place well after Vice President Pence returned from Warsaw. And after the meeting, the Warsaw meeting with Vice President Pence, Ambassador Sondland quickly pulled aside Andrei Yermak, Zelensky's top aide, and informed him that the aid would not be forthcoming until Ukraine publicly announced the two investigations that President Trump wanted. So here we are. After the meeting, right after the meeting, they're still in Warsaw, and Zelensky pulls aside his Ukrainian counterpart, Yermak, and explains the aid is not coming until the investigations are announced.
Based on my previous communication with Secretary Pompeo, I felt comfortable sharing my concerns with Mr. Yermak. It was a very, very brief pull-aside conversation that happened within a few seconds. I told Mr. Yermak that I believed that the resumption of U.S. aid would likely not occur until Ukraine took some kind of action on the public statement that we had been discussing for many weeks.
I mean, let's let that sink in for a minute, too. You've heard my colleagues at the other table say, Ukrainians felt no pressure. There's no evidence they felt any pressure. Of course, we've already had testimony about how they did feel pressure and they didn't want to be drawn into this political campaign. And you saw over and over in these text messages and emails, no, you go first, you announce, no, you go first. And we're supposed to believe they felt no pressure. And there it is, it breaks out into the open. The military aid is being withheld. And there's a connection between the holding of the military aid and these investigations. And the first thing they're asking about, they send the copy of the article, what's happening with this aid? They're ready to come to D.C. to plead for the aid. They go to Warsaw, they meet with the Vice President. It's the first question is the aid. And what happens after that meeting? Now, that's a big meeting, by the way, with the Vice President, the Ukrainian delegation. It's not like in front of all those people, the Vice President is going to bring it up. And so Sondland goes up to his counterpart right after that on the sidelines of that meeting, and he says, basically, you ain't getting the money until you do the investigations. And we're to believe they felt no pressure? Folks, they're at war. They're at war, and they're being told you're not getting $400 million in aid you need unless you do what the President wants, and what the President wants are these two investigations. If you don't believe that's pressure, that's $400 million worth of pressure. I got a bridge I want to sell you. And it's hard for us to put ourselves in the Ukrainians' position. I mean, imagine the eastern third of our country were occupied by an enemy force. And we're beholden to another country for military aid. and they're saying you're not going to get it until you do what we want, do you think we'd feel pressured? I think we'd feel pressured. And that's exactly the situation the Ukrainians were in now. You've heard the other counsel say before, well, but they say they don't feel pressure. Like they're going to admit they were being shaken down by the President of the United States. You think they feel pressure now? You should see what kind of pressure they feel if they admitted that. Tim Morrison, the NSC official, witnessed the conversation between Sondland and YERMAK from across the room and immediately thereafter received a summary from Ambassador Sondland. He reported the substance of that conversation to his boss, Ambassador Bolton, who told Morrison to consult with the lawyers. Go talk to the lawyers. You know, if you keep getting told you got to go talk to the lawyers, there's a problem. If things are perfect, you don't get told, go talk to the lawyers time and time again. Morrison confirmed that he did talk to the lawyers, in part to ensure there was a record of what Ambassador Sondland was doing. That record exists within the White House. Would you like me to read you that record? I'd be happy to read you that record. It's there for your asking. Of course, the President has refused to provide that record. Precisely why did Ambassador Bolton direct Morrison to tell the lawyers, to talk to the lawyers? Would you like Ambassador Bolton to tell you why he said that? He'd be happy to tell you why he said that. He's there for your asking. What did Bolton know about the freeze in aid prior to this meeting in Warsaw? What did he mean that if he can press Zelensky, it's going to depend on whether he can press Zelensky? Would you like to know what that meant? I'd like to know what he meant by that. I think we know what he meant by that. Tim Morrison also conveyed the substance of the Sondland-YERMAK pull-aside to his colleague, Ambassador Taylor. So this is now Tim Morrison, told by Bolton, go talk to the lawyers, and he talks to also Ambassador Taylor, our ambassador in Ukraine.
On the evening of September 1st, I received a readout of the PENCE-ZELENSKY meeting over the phone from Mr. Morrison, during which he told me that President Zelensky had opened the meeting by immediately asking Vice President about the security cooperation. The Vice President did not respond substantively, but said that he would talk to President Trump that night. The Vice President did say that President Trump wanted the Europeans to do more to support Ukraine and that he wanted the Ukrainians to do more to fight corruption. During the same phone call with Mr. Morrison, he described a conversation Ambassador Sondland had with Mr. YERMAK in Warsaw. Ambassador Sondland told Mr. YERMAK that the security assistance money would not come until President Zelensky committed to pursue the BURISMA investigation. I was alarmed by what Mr. Morrison told me about the Sondland-YERMAK conversation.
Ambassador Taylor then explained why he was so alarmed by this turn. Let's hear that as well.
You said previously that you were alarmed to learn this. Why were you alarmed?
It's one thing to try to leverage a meeting in the White House. It's another thing, I thought, to leverage security assistance to a country at war, dependent on both the security assistance and the demonstration of support. It was much more alarming. The White House meeting was one thing, security assistance was much more alarming.
Upon learning from Mr. Morrison that the military aid may be conditioned on Ukraine publicly announcing these two investigations, Ambassador Taylor sends an urgent text message to Ambassador Sondland asking, are we now saying that security assistance and White House meeting are conditioned on investigations? And the response by Ambassador Sondland, call me. Well, you know what that means, right? You get a text message that's putting it in black and white. Are we saying security assistance and the White House meeting are conditioned on investigations? Call me. In other words, don't put this in writing. Call me. Ambassador Taylor did in fact call Sondland. Informed by notes he took at the time of the call, he summarized that conversation as follows.
During that phone call, Ambassador Sondland told me that President Trump had told him that he wants President Zelensky to state publicly that Ukraine will investigate BURISMA and alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election. Ambassador Sondland also told me that he now recognized that he had made a mistake by earlier telling Ukrainian officials that only a White House meeting with President Zelensky was dependent on a public announcement of the investigations. In fact, Ambassador Sondland said, everything was dependent on such an announcement, including security assistance. He said that President Trump wanted President Zelensky in a public box by making a public statement about ordering such investigations.
Ambassador Taylor testified that his contemporaneous notes of the call reflect that Sondland used the phrase public box to describe President Trump's desire to ensure that the initiation of his desired investigations was announced publicly. A private commitment was not good enough. The State Department has Ambassador Taylor's extensive notes, and of course, we would like to show them to you to corroborate his testimony. But pursuant to the President's instructions, the State Department will not turn them over. You might recall from the tape yesterday, Ambassador Taylor said, they'll be shortly coming, I'm told. Well, somebody countermanded that instructions. Who do we think that was? But you should see them. If you have any question about what Sondland told Ambassador Taylor, if the President's counsel tries to create any confusion about what Sondland told Taylor about his conversation with the President, and look, Sondland had one recollection in his deposition and another recollection in the first hearing and another recollection in the declaration. You want to know exactly what happened in that conversation when it was fresh in Sondland's mind and he told Taylor about it and Taylor wrote it in its notes. You're going to want Taylor's notes. In any courtroom in America holding a fair trial, you would want to see contemporaneous notes. This Senate should be no different. Demand those notes. Demand to see the truth. We're not afraid of those notes. We haven't seen them. We haven't seen them. Maybe those notes say something completely different. Maybe those notes say no quid pro quo. Maybe those notes say it's a perfect call. I'd like to see them. I'm willing to trust Ambassador Taylor's testimony and his recollection. I'd like to see them. I'd like to show them to you. They're yours for the asking. On September 25th, the Washington Post editorial board reported concerns that President Trump was withholding military assistance for Ukraine in a White House meeting in order to force President Zelensky to announce investigations of Vice President Biden and purported Ukrainian interference in the U.S. election. The Post editorial board wrote, "We're reliably told that the President has a second and more venal agenda. He is attempting to force Mr. Zelensky to intervene in the 2020 presidential election by launching an investigation of the leading Democratic candidate, Joe Biden. Mr. Trump is not just soliciting Ukraine's help with his presidential campaign. He is using U.S. military aid the country desperately needs in an attempt to extort it." So that's September 25th. President on notice, scheme discovered. September 5th. September 7th, the evidence shows President Trump has a call with Ambassador Sondland, where the President made the corrupt bargain for military aid in the White House meeting even more explicit. On September 7th, Ambassador Sondland spoke to President Trump on the telephone. After that conversation, Ambassador Sondland called Tim Morrison to update him on that conversation. Unlike Sondland, who testified that he never took notes, Morrison took notes of the conversation and recalled it during his public testimony. Let's listen.
Now, a few days later, on September 7th, you spoke again to Ambassador Sondland, who told you that he had just gotten off the phone with President Trump. Isn't that right?
That sounds correct, yes.
What did Ambassador Sondland tell you that President Trump said to him?
If I recall this conversation correctly, this was where Ambassador Sondland related that there was no quid pro quo, but President Zelensky had to make the statement and that he had to want to do it.
And by that point, did you understand that the statement related to the Biden and 2016 investigations?
I think I did, yes.
And that was essentially a condition for the security assistance to be released?
I understood that that's what Ambassador Sondland believed.
After speaking with President Trump?
That's what he represented.
Now, you should bear in mind when Mr. Morrison says that's what he represented, that we asked Mr. Morrison about the President's calls with Ambassador Sondland, and he testified that every time he checked to see did Ambassador Sondland in fact talk with the President, when he said that he did, that yes, in fact, he talked with the President. Every time he checked, he was able to confirm it. Now, let's let this sink in for a minute. According to Mr. Morrison's testimony, former Republican staffer on the Armed Services Committee, he speaks with Sondland on September 7th, and Sondland says he's just gotten off the phone with Trump. Okay, so this is contemporaneous. Just got off the phone. Call is fresh in everybody's mind. And what was said? Morrison says, Ambassador Sondland related there was no quid pro quo, but President Zelensky had to make the statement, and he had to want to do it. No quid pro quo, but there's a quid pro quo. Now, there are notes that show this. There's a written record of this. There's a written record of what President Trump told Ambassador Sondland right after that call. Would you like to see that written record? It's called Mr. Morrison's notes. It's right there for the asking. If these fine lawyers over here want to persuade you that call didn't happen or wasn't said, or all he said was no quid pro quo, he never said, but you have to go to the mic and you have to want to do it, well, there's a good way to find out what happened on that call because it's in writing. Is there any question why they're withholding this from Congress? Is there any question about that? They didn't claim, well, Mr. Morrison didn't claim absolute immunity, and Mr. Sondland didn't claim absolute immunity. There's no absolute immunity over these notes, no executive privilege over these notes. The notes have already been described, the conversation's already been released. There's no even plausible, arguable, invented even excuse for withholding these notes. Wouldn't you like to see them? I could tell you in any courtroom in America you'd get to see them. This should be no different. Wouldn't be any different in a fair trial anywhere in America. Morrison again informed Ambassador Bolton of this September 7th conversation, and guess what Ambassador Bolton said? I think you could probably figure this out by now. Go talk to the lawyers. Go talk to the lawyers. And yet again, for the third time, Morrison went to talk to the lawyers about this conversation with Ambassador Sondland. Morrison also called Ambassador Taylor to inform him about the conversation, and we have the testimony from Ambassador Taylor about their conversation, which is also based on his contemporaneous notes. Let's look at the conversation now between Mr. Morrison and Ambassador Taylor.
According to Mr. Morrison, President Trump told Ambassador Sondland he was not asking for a quid pro quo. But President Trump did insist that President Zelensky go to a microphone and say he is opening investigations of Biden and 2016 election interference, and that President Zelensky should want to do this himself.
Okay, so here we have two witnesses taking contemporaneous notes, both reflecting the same conversation. conversation between Sondland and the President in which the President says no quid pro quo, but quid pro quo. There are documents that prove this. Documents that prove this, that are yours for the asking. The following day, September 8th, Sondland texts Taylor and Volker to bring them up to speed on the conversations with President Trump and subsequently President Zelensky, whom he spoke to after President Trump. Guys, multiple conversations with Z, meaning Zelensky, POTUS, let's talk. Sondland spoke to Taylor, but not Volker shortly after this text. According to Ambassador Taylor, who testified again on his real-time notes, let's hear what he said.
The following day, on September 8th, Ambassador Sondland and I spoke on the phone. He confirmed that he had talked to President Trump, as I had suggested a week earlier, but that President Trump was adamant that President Zelensky himself had to clear things up and do it in public. President Trump said it was not a quid pro quo.
So it's all very consistent here. What the President said, no quid pro quo, but Zelensky must announce the investigations publicly, was what he was telling Sondland. No quid pro quo except for the quid pro quo. The President's attorneys rely on the first half of that sentence and would like you to forget the second half ever happened. But we don't have to leave our common sense at the door. We don't have to rely on an incomplete description of that call. We have instead the detailed notes of Mr. Morrison and Ambassador Taylor. But we also know what President Trump told Sondland because Sondland relayed that message to President Zelensky. During the same September 8 conversation with Taylor, Sondland described his conversation with President Zelensky. Here's Ambassador Taylor's account of it.
Ambassador Sondland also said that he had talked to President Zelensky and Mr. Yermak and had told them that although this was not a quid pro quo, if President Zelensky did not clear things up in public, we would be at a stalemate. I understood a stalemate to mean that Ukraine would not receive the much-needed military assistance. Ambassador Sondland said that this conversation concluded with President Zelensky agreeing to make a public statement in an interview on CNN.
So not only did Ambassador Sondland relate this conversation to Mr. Morrison and Mr. Taylor, not only did Ambassador Taylor, Mr. Morrison talk about it, but Sondland confirms that he's relayed this conversation to Zelensky himself. Everyone was now in the loop on the military aid being withheld for the political investigations. Taylor continued recalling the startling analogy Ambassador Sondland used to describe President Trump's approach to Ukraine.
During our call on September 8th, Ambassador Sondland tried to explain to me that President Trump is a businessman. When a businessman is about to sign a check to someone who owes him something, the businessman asks that person to pay up before signing the check. Ambassador Volker used the same language several days later while we were together at the Yalta European Strategy Conference. I argued to both that the explanation made no sense. The Ukrainians did not owe President Trump anything.
Ambassador Taylor testified that at the end of the Sondland-Zelensky conversation, President Zelensky said that he had relented and agreed to do a CNN interview to announce the investigations. So there was a breakthrough after all. The promised meeting wasn't enough. The withheld security assistance broke the logjam. Zelensky was going to go on CNN and announce the investigations. Taylor, though, remained concerned that even if the Ukrainian leader did as President Trump required, President Trump might continue to withhold the vital U.S. security assistance in any event. Ambassador Taylor texted his concerns to Ambassador Volker and Sondland, stating, "The nightmare is they give the interview and don't get the security assistance. The Russians love it, and I quit." I mean, that's quite telling, too. What's Ambassador Taylor worried about? He's worried the Ukrainians are finally going to agree to do it. They're going to make the announcement, and they're still going to get stiffed on the aid. At his deposition, Ambassador Taylor elaborated
No, we don't, and I would hate to speculate about a number. We've heard people